Our civilization rose so much through the mind that it sometimes becomes difficult to reincarnate our own bodies. And yet, when we surrender ourselves to one another, I see the wild beasts come back out. We scratch each other's backs and kiss each... What? Where's this game from? Okay, that makes sense. Some of you might not be aware of the gravity of the situation that is currently unfolding on this channel, but I think it's safe to say at this point I am recognized around the world for my video game reviews. Because of this, I get a lot of emails. The other day, while checking said emails, I got one from a developer called Redlock, basically saying, hey, our game is out of early access, fully released, here is the Steam key. After checking out the game, I realized that it was an early access title that I had wishlisted on Steam for a very long time, called Shattered: Tale of the Forgotten King. Shattered has a lot of things that I like to see in a game. It's an indie game made by a small studio of about 12 people, and it's their first game, so you know it will have a high level of weird jank and experimentation. It has a classic indie developer low poly art style and a rich, saturated color palette. It's touched by the spirit of Hidetaka Miyazaki. And now, since the game is officially out of early access, I can take a look at it without needing to worry about the developers stacking all their early access money into a big pile and burning it like the Joker, which has definitely come back to bite me in the past. Shattered is extremely ambitious. From a mechanical perspective, it seems like the developers wanted to build a game that had a massive, open, Breath of the Wild style hub world surrounded by smaller, branching sections that would act more as semi-linear, Souls-like levels. All of this dotted with side-scrolling platform sections. It's an insane project for a team this small to tackle as their first game, but the most insane part is that they kind of almost pulled it off. Shattered starts here in Limbo. You go through a tutorial breaking down all of the Souls-style mechanics. By now, I don't need to explain how this combat works. I don't need to explain the parry system. I don't need to explain how your currency/experience points work. I don't need to describe how weapon upgrades work. All of you know this shit. I never need to explain to anyone ever again what Souls-like mechanics are, any more than I need to explain to anyone what a Super Mario is. You get it. After making your way through Limbo, you'll get to this game's NPC hub, where you can upgrade weapons, level up, and talk to the lead developer of the Nier series. You also unlock this gateway, which will take you out of Limbo into the game's actual world. For the first several hours, you'll progress through classic, Souls-inspired levels in a semi-linear direction from this portal forward. Now at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, so this is going to be a quick and easy Souls clone with a more linear design like Dark Souls 3. But then you get to this gigantic open world map and unlock the hoverboard, and it's very clear that Shattered has bigger and better plans. This transition from what is familiar into an insane genre twist 3 hours into the game is incredible pacing. Just when you start to think maybe you're getting bored, or maybe it's not going to be that exciting or interesting, or maybe you don't even like video games anymore, or maybe the Souls formula is tired and we should all stop living in the past trying to recapture the feelings we had the first time we played Dark Souls 1. It drops you right into the deep end in a way that almost feels overwhelming. I can't stress enough how perfect the timing on this is to squeeze the optimal amount of surprise out of the player. So now that we've arrived at the open world section of the game, let's talk about that first. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, this open world basically acts as a colossal hub world. You need to explore it to find entrances to the areas that branch off into the smaller, Souls-style levels. Think of it like the Nexus from Demon's Souls, only fucking gigantic. I also mentioned that it was a Breath of the Wild style open world, and when I say that, I actually mean it. I'm not some troglodytic Twitter user that sees a game with a green field in it and assumes the developers are infringing on Nintendo's copyright on grass. What I mean is, the open world is pretty clearly formatted in the Breath of the Wild type style. You have enemy camps scattered around the map with reward chests. You have weird secret shrine things that you can find for items, more on those later, and you can kind of just do whatever in any order you want. You even have these big teleporter type tower things which you can use for fast travel. The inspiration and influence here are pretty obvious. In order for me to get farther into how well this open world is or is not executed, we need to talk about the idea of empty open worlds. One of the most common criticisms you will find of literally any open world game that has ever been made is people will say that it's empty. It doesn't matter what game it is, or if the statement is even true, someone, somewhere will bitch about any open world being empty. Whether or not you think an open world is empty, or if it is, you think that's even a bad thing, is largely a subjective opinion in most cases. And depending on the game, a large empty world can work very well. For example, Shadow of the Colossus is one of the most beloved games in the history of the medium. When it's broken down into its component pieces, Shadow of the Colossus is essentially a boss rush that is constantly interrupted by a massive, empty, open world. But the thing is, this empty world is kind of what makes the game great. The sense of scale, the feeling that you're in a forbidden, abandoned land that you aren't supposed to be in, the feeling of I'm making a mistake that constantly hangs over the player for the entire game. All of this wouldn't be possible if the game wasn't taking place in a giant, empty world. Riding a horse through all this shit gives you time to really reflect on the game for a minute and start to really notice how forgotten and dead this place is. It sets the tone for the entire game. My point is, as far as the world being empty, when it works, it works. And in the case of Shattered, it definitely works more than it doesn't. And I will admit that from a subjective perspective, I'm biased in favor of enjoying this kind of level design. The enormous sense of scale that you get from hoverboarding around the world, and that same Forbidden Lands vibe you get from Shadow of the Colossus, work for me. I don't mind having to take a few minutes to get from point A to point B across an empty landscape when it looks and feels this good. All of this being said, this execution definitely isn't perfect, and even for me, there are sections that were pretty blatantly not finished or a little bit too empty. This giant tree area, for example, seems to be totally devoid of anything other than a kind of cool tree. As far as the open world feeling unfinished at times, that largely boils down to the way exiting this open world area works, the way the lore is delivered, and other things that just seem to kind of be artifacts of features that were abandoned during development. The entire point of exploring this place from the perspective of progress is you need to find the various exits to outside levels in order to kill bosses, which will eventually let you progress to the end of the game. So every time you find a weird pathway or some hidden ruins, you get excited thinking, okay, this is the way to the next level. The problem is, sometimes this excitement will be interrupted with either one of these fragments or some kind of a lore dump, which are just sort of nothing. These fragments can be used to level up or sold to this guy for the currency that you normally use to level up, which is very weird. It seems like their original purpose was for some kind of a feature or an idea that was abandoned at some point in development. These big shrines that you can sometimes find them in just seem too visually imposing to not have originally been intended as a big deal or more mechanically important. This feeling of features being abandoned and cut content is all over the open world area of the game, which can get kind of frustrating. The game hypes up this idea of the 12 demiurges very early on, so it's likely that the original idea for the game was the player needing to fight 12 bosses that they find by exploring this big open world. I've seen this idea somewhere before, but I can't quite remember where. In reality, this game ends up having like 6 bosses, only 3 of which are the demiurges, plus this reoccurring fight with what seems to be the player's Shadow Link. The other 6 or so boss ideas needing to be scrapped is probably what led to such a blatantly empty world. I'm sure this tree area was originally planned to be a boss arena or something. To get back to the point that I was making, these fragments are also what you use to unlock the lore dumps. Now, to some people, I am sure, finding a secret lore stone is going to be exciting and a good reward for exploration. I'm not one of those people. It's clear that the developers spent a lot of time planning and writing the in-game lore, but I'm not really a lore guy. That isn't to say the lore in this game isn't interesting. I'll talk about it a little bit later, but it doesn't really seem worthy of being a big reward. Typically in games like this, your exploration is rewarded with some kind of an item, like a weapon or armor in the case of the Souls series, or some kind of a hidden boss like Gwendolyn, or in some other way of progressing through the game mechanically, like how Ashen rewarded you with feathers that permanently increased your stats. The lore sort of surrounds all of that like background radiation. It seems to me that Redlock may have made the classic mistake of thinking the lore is front and center, and of course it would be easy to fall into seeing this illusion if you pay too much attention to the way people talk about it online. In reality, these games have sort of a lore paradox. The story details you get are good because you need to dig them up, not because they were placed right in front of you on a big rock. Of course, this is an opinion, and if you're a huge book-reading nerd, you might love this. I'm not really sure how well they're written. They definitely have translation errors since the original language was likely French. They're also French in some other interesting ways. There are even a couple areas like this snowy mountain where you clear out a shitload of guys and find a bunch of switches to open a huge door, and you're expecting it to be the next boss you need to fight. Nope. 3 lore stones. This is a very weird choice. I assume this is another spot where one of the original 12 bosses was going to go. My point is, these lore dumps don't make the empty parts of the game feel less empty, and neither do these fragments, which kind of feel like a scrapped idea. So, what's left? The answer is the exits to the other part of the game that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes they go to one of these Watcher boss fights, which is how you unlock new weapons and get these power cores that have an ambiguous use, and other times they will lead to a more traditional Souls-like level with the same trademark level design you're used to. I want to draw one last comparison to Shadow of the Colossus here because I maintain it's the best way of thinking about this game. Basically, you're wandering this huge, dead, empty world looking for your next boss, just like Shadow of the Colossus. But instead of just triggering the next fight in the boss rush, you're triggering a massive Souls-inspired level. When Shattered is doing that, it's excelling. When I hoverboard across an ancient battlefield that is a little bit too big and a little bit too empty, and then transition into a beautiful, tightly designed desert temple type city that seems like it's just floating out in deep space, that's cool. And that's what makes this open world work. Once you get into the incredibly well-designed side areas, you can kind of forgive the massive swaths of empty land, because in this context, the point of the open world isn't really to give you reasonable level design. The point is to give you something else. A sense of adventure, and a weird feeling of being somewhere you shouldn't be. This is what the open world area of Shattered should have tried to be. The weird fragment shrines, the lore stones, and the enemy camps all just kind of felt like experiments thrown at a wall to see what stuck, which is also in its own right fun to see, but in this case, I think they almost kind of distracted from the real magic, which is this place being so big and empty in the first place. Next, let's actually talk about the side areas. These are by far the most well-executed parts of the game. Redlock has a really strong understanding of what makes Souls-like level design so good. The maps are all collapsed in on themselves and have all kinds of weird shortcuts and hidden items. You also, of course, are surrounded by all kinds of enemies that you can fight that will drop your experience currency and other items. At this point, we all know what this sort of level design is like. It's like a 3D Metroidvania or something. In a general sense, these places are built very well in Shattered. In terms of both the literal level geometry and how the levels are planned out, and also their beautiful, saturated, low-poly color palettes, which is my personal all-time favorite video game art style. But the most fun part about these places is a little more unexpected. Shattered has quite a few more platforming mechanics than a typical game of its genre. You have a jump, a double jump, a dash, and all of these things combined mean you get a pretty impressive amount of mobility. You can very often get to parts of the level geometry that you shouldn't be able to, and most interestingly, in most cases, the developers will reward you for getting to areas you shouldn't be able to. I was even able to find a couple sequence breaks like this one, where I was able to totally skip a locked door without getting the key, just by finding a way to jump around on top of the level. I've already talked about this game having a feeling of I shouldn't be here, and to see it incorporated into the level design to this degree is wild. Most developers would put up invisible walls or some kind of an obstacle to make sure that players couldn't get out into these parts of their levels, but Redlock not only lets you out here, but says, "Good job. Here's some items." I can't tell if this is a consequence of inexperienced devs just fucking around with level design, or if it's genuinely genius. It also makes sense in the context of the game's story, which I'll talk about soon. Finally, let's talk about the game's final sections, these side-scrolling ones. At first you might think these would be a fucking nightmare, but actually this game's platforming mechanics and movement feel pretty good, and most of the time when I felt like it was my fault and not the game's fault, which is a good sign. These areas do kind of get abandoned about halfway through the game though, and just stop showing up. It's clear the developers sort of ran out of time to make them work. This long-ass tunnel with platforms is a good example. First of all, you'll notice that the camera doesn't lock into side-scrolling view like it obviously was intended to do. Second, you'll notice that this platforming section is very quick and easy in its design and is pretty much just platforms moving in the same pattern all the way across. It's also the only platforming section in the game that made me want to push my PC into a canyon. But before all that, when the game is actually committing to these sections early on, they're fantastic. This area is by far the best one in terms of the idea being executed. Having sections like this to break up the monotony of the more traditional Souls game is actually a pretty smart idea that kind of shakes up pacing in an interesting way. Right when you start to get bored, the camera locks into place and you know things are about to get different. And right when you start to get annoyed with platforming, the camera opens back up again and now you're playing a normal 3D game. This idea is sound on paper, but like most of its mechanics, Shattered couldn't quite get a handle on executing it through the entire game. And that really is sort of the story of Shattered in general. It's a bunch of ideas in a blender put together into a beautiful, janky mess. And speaking of story, let's get somewhat into the lore a little bit. Just looking at the game's surreal level design, reading some of the notes on items, and listening to some of what the characters say, as well as all the sound design, it becomes pretty clear that this game isn't taking place in a natural reality. If you have any kind of a brain at all, it won't surprise you to learn that this game is taking place inside of some kind of a simulation. A simulation that has had its data and code corrupted, which explains why everything is so weird and disconnected. This plot point goes a long way to just generally describing the game. The reason you can just jump out onto part of the level that doesn't seem like it should exist is because it shouldn't exist. The game world is corrupted. It isn't put together correctly. This functions as an in-universe way to explain the game's fantastic level of French jank, and I fucking loved it. Again, I don't know if this is something that is accidental or intentionally genius. Before I wrap this video up, I want to get into some of the more specific things that are either good or bad in terms of design that weren't a big enough deal to justify their own sections. First, the animation in Shattered is very odd. I've messed around with some 3D animation, but I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, so I have no idea exactly what is wrong with these animations. I can give you all the classic descriptors like unresponsive and clunky, but I don't know what those really mean here. The best way that I can describe it is that the animations don't seem to blend together well, and they don't seem to be designed with each other in mind. If you do this jump attack, there's a long period of time where you're sort of just standing there recovering from the animation, when in most games, you would blend into a new one much more quickly. Attack animations of the player and enemies don't really seem to cooperate well with each other at times. It's almost like the attack animations were just sort of independently designed without considering how they would interact with each other. This game's animation is definitely not its strongest point, but I don't think that makes the game unplayable like some people have suggested. The way weapons work is also strange. First of all, they are all swords, and they all share the same moveset, with the exception of this sword, which ends in a double attack instead of a single attack. All of the weapons being the same weapon with slightly different stats is weird and doesn't really work well. I would have preferred just some sort of upgrading system to this. Just give me one sword and then give me some stats to level up for its attack speed and damage or something. My theory is that originally the team probably intended for a lot of these weapons to have different movesets, but just didn't actually have the time to animate all of them. This makes finding new weapons unfortunately boring. Another thing you'll run into is just weird moments of unpolished gameplay, like colliders either being inactive or active in appropriate places, or missing sound effects on the reboot animation. There are a lot of missing sound effects. A guy this big falling over should make a noise. And finally, this game's 2D character design when interacting with NPCs is fantastic. I loved the art design here. I like the masks. Yet another game with cool masks in it. You can get so much personality out of a highly stylized mask so much more quickly and easily than with an actual human face. I will always appreciate a real art style over an attempt at realism. Plus, including a character that looks like the Mothman will immediately increase the odds of me giving your game a positive review by about 3 times. Playing this game and getting lost in its weird, experimental, and surreal level design, never really knowing where the fuck I was or if the developers even intended me to get there in the first place, all stacked on top of this game's existential and abstract story, all kind of gave me the same vibes as I. Come to think of it, both of these games are French. That might just be how French people make games. If that's the case, I need to play more French indie games, because this shit rules. Part of the fun of playing indie games is being able to just try to figure out the thought process of the developers. Playing Shattered is kind of like learning how to make a game right along with the devs. You get to see all their odd mistakes, their weird creative ideas that wouldn't make it into a game from a bigger studio or a more experienced team, and that's what makes this actually interesting. Is Shattered a good game? I'm not sure. A game this weird and unfinished kind of transcends the terms of good and bad. If you go into it expecting a polished experience on par with a AAA game or even a more experienced and put together indie team, you'll be disappointed. If you go into this game understanding that it's a very, very ambitious experiment being tackled by a tiny team of 6 to 12 surrealist French dudes, I think you'll probably enjoy it. This is a game that's going to be most enjoyed by video game hipsters like me that want to play weird, janky indie games while sipping tea and writing a pretentious YouTube script. If that sounds like you, then I guess I can recommend it. If you want to see more videos like this one, consider subscribing. Leaving a like and a comment are also very helpful. If you want to actually get notifications for the channel, click the cursed bell and turn them on. Down in the description, I also have a link to my active Discord community, which you can join, and you should also follow me on Twitter so you don't miss any important updates. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.